Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, and as we just alluded to on the other side of the break, we're going to be moving on here into the Miami Heat's offseason because overall it has been very quiet for them. The Heat, a team that just made the finals 2 years ago, and it feels like they have largely fallen into irrelevance since then. Now, Jimmy Butler has been dealing with a lot of injuries as well that sort of takes away from what that Heat team has, but, at the same time, the Heat were a little bit of a mess last year, and ultimately they did make the 8 seed, and, maybe they would have stood a little bit more of a chance if Butler was playing. I mean, they also were missing Terry Rozier for that playoff series against the Celtics as well. I would have taken the Celtics over the Heat anyways, but that being said, I do feel like with some of those injuries, and I think it would have taken a lot for them to just all of a sudden hop back into being really competitive, knowing that Rozier still hadn't really fully meshed in with the Heat. It was a slow start for him. He started to work his way back into, the identity of the Heat, but he was dealing with that neck injury that ended up keeping him out. And then Jimmy Butler, of course, with the knee injury that he suffered during the play-in tournament game. So I do think that now with a full training camp, with understanding what the current makeup of the roster is, if everybody's fully healthy, I do buy into what the Heat have more. Last year, their offense was really atrocious for a lot of the year, and that's why they went out to go get a Terry Rozier at the trade deadline. But you missed Jimmy Butler for a lot of the year. Terry Rozier, of course, like I just mentioned, wasn't even on the roster for the first half of the year, and then even when he came back, was dealing with injuries, and Tyler Hero as well missed a lot of last season. So you'd like to think that if they are all able to actually mesh with one another and stay healthy, that they could return to some level of, prominence and relevancy again. I do want to, before we sort of dive into what the vision looks like entirely with the Heat moving forward, just talk about what has gone down so far in this offseason, because it's been pretty quiet for the most part. The loudest amount of noise that has come out so far was actually them being turned down by Caleb Martin in free agency. Now, this is something that, before we dive into it, I blame Miami in no way because of this. It was really an all-time modern bag fumble from Caleb Martin to let this slip away, because what the Heat had offered Martin was, they said, if you pick up your $7.1 million player option this offseason, we will then give you a 4-year contract extension after that worth $58 million. And when he declined the option, it took that offer off of the table because the Miami Heat didn't have the same flexibility as they did. It would have been a little bit cheaper in year one playing for $7.1 million, and then the bigger money would have kicked in. And Caleb Martin's camp seemed to think that they were going to get more money in the open market, and that just was not the case. So once Miami was off the table with that, $65 million offer in total between the player option and the $58 million extension, he ended up having to settle for a 4-year contract worth $32 million with the 76ers, which is over $30 million less than his offer in Miami. And for whatever it's worth as well, it's a little bit of a cliche, but in sports, but when you talk about Florida, you're talking about the no state taxes, and that is not going to be the case. So it probably ends up being, more than $30 million when it all adds down to that. But, again, Martin just definitely misplayed his hand here. Barry Jackson of the Miami Herald reported on the negotiation process, and he said that the decisions from Martin's camp left the Heat, quote, dumbfounded, and there really wasn't anything that the Heat could have done once Martin turned down their offer and declined that player option. They were unable to give him, that contract once again. So I don't want to get on the Heat's case for any of that. Caleb Martin did have a little bit of an interesting quote to kind of pile on to the weirdness of this story, where he was speaking to, a radio station, I believe it was, in Philadelphia, and he talked about how he signed with the 76ers because, quote, being a part of that winning culture and something bigger than yourself is something that draws you in. It's an interesting quote when you break it down, when you talk about, it's a little bit of a tough look for Heat culture, which has been, again, another one of those almost cliches, but there is some legitimacy to it as well in terms of the operation that Eric Spoelstra and Pat Riley run there in Miami. But it would be one thing if he signed somewhere where there was a little bit more of an established culture of winning. I just don't think that Philadelphia is that. This is the same organization that spent basically an entire decade, that's a little dramatic, but, the better part of the 2010s at least, trying to tank in order to acquire as much young talent as possible. And really, they only got one player out of it, after drafting Michael Carter-Williams and Jahlil Okafor and Nerlens Noel. Joel Embiid is the only one that actually panned out for them, so at least in terms of their early lottery draft picks. So just an interesting quote, I think, for Martin to put out there. Chances are he just had to say whatever he could to win over Philadelphia. But again, just a very strange series of transactions here. And, Martin, for whatever it's worth, is probably going to have a bigger role in Philadelphia than he would have in Miami. I think he's probably slated to be a starter. I would imagine it's going to be him, Tyrese Maxey, Paul George, Kelly Oubre, and Joel Embiid. And then, the rest of the rotation has been filled out a little bit with some of their offseason signings. Maybe some of their rookies, and Jared McCain and Adem Bona could end up playing for them. But, either way, Martin is probably in that starting lineup, and I think it's a good pickup for the 76ers. Obviously, when you talk about Caleb Martin and his biggest moments, you initially go to the 2023 Eastern Conference Finals, where he was incredible against the Boston Celtics and was the real X factor in all of that. So, Philly trying to overcome Boston, you feel like you maybe have a little bit of a Celtics killer there, but that will definitely, be determined as the season moves on here. But, for the Heat, as much as I do not blame them for what went down with Martin turning them down and ending up leaving in free agency, where does that leave them? Because the roster is mostly the same as it was last year, and they were an 8 seed, and for a lot of the regular season, didn't look good for them. Now, again, I mentioned the injuries that they were dealing with, and maybe the cohesiveness of, is that a word? Cohesion? You know what I mean. Of the offense can look better next year with people actually getting playing time with one another, but it's mostly the same for them. Now, they drafted Kel'el Ware, who was excellent in his second summer league game and has gotten a lot of Heat fans excited there. He could definitely be a rotation player for them. I'm really curious to see how he sort of fits in with that established group, whether or not we are going to be able to see some double big lineups with him and Bam Adebayo together. We'll see there. Second round draft pick of Pele Larson, who I liked when he was at Arizona. I'm not totally sold on whether or not he's an NBA player, but, we'll see. I thought it was pretty good value for them there, and I think they picked him at 44th. They signed Alec Burks in free agency. He had some moments as well a little bit when the Knicks were entirely, running on fumes in terms of injuries. Had some moments there at the end of the Indiana Pacers series in the second round, but other than that, again, the roster's pretty much the same, where you're talking about 3 guys I just mentioned. Not totally sure what their role is going to be with the Heat next season, if they're even going to get playing time, and they just sort of, their other moves are re-signing Haywood Highsmith, Kevin Love, and Thomas Bryant, who are all solid players as well. So I don't think the Heat are bad by any means, but did they really get better this offseason? Coming off of a year that was definitely disappointing. And the Heat were handicapped financially for sure. Their current payroll is just over $170 million, which is the luxury tax. Now, it's not in the first or second apron, but it is at least high enough that the ownership group is going to have to pay that luxury tax. And it's not like they could go out and sign anybody in free agency this past year. So I think that really for the Heat, I mean, the Jimmy Butler conversation is one of its own, and we've talked about it already this summer. I mean, he would have been moved already by now this summer if the Heat were going to really shake things up. I would have to imagine, at least. So, Butler's going to be back, and you feel like with him and with Eric Spoelstra, you probably have a pretty good chance to be competitive. My biggest issue with them, though, is the fact that they have 5 players that will be making at least $19 million next season, and with only a couple of them, do you feel great about the guaranteed production? It is Jimmy Butler, of course, Bam Adebayo, no-brainers there. Terry Rozier, who, again, I do have some belief in, and I think that year 2, he is going to fit in better in Miami. Then it's Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson. And I think that when you look at that, Robinson is at least only one more fully guaranteed season that if they needed to part ways with in, next summer, they could probably do so pretty well. Maybe they could, sell him off to a rebuilding team for a little bit of extra space at the deadline. But the Heat are going to need to get Tyler Hero off the books, I think. And his trade value is extremely low right now, so that was never really a possibility. If he can stay healthy through the first half of next year, I think that is definitely possible for him to build it back up. And you saw during the playoffs that maybe he does have a little bit of ability of being an improved playmaker that could help his value, but the issue was he was just an absolute turnstile on defense. The Celtics were possession after possession trying to attack him, and I don't know if you really have any faith in him being able to improve on that side of the ball. Now, let me know in the comments section whether or not you feel differently, but I think that Hero is probably the biggest detriment to that Heat roster right now. And if he can reemerge as a 6th man of the year and isn't a liability on defense, it's just so tough under this new luxury tax and the current CBA, the way that you are penalized so heavily for spending big. Because honestly, when they first gave Hero the contract, it was a lot for sure, but at the same time, I didn't think it was, crippling. But as the years go on here now, like $29 million allocated to him is a lot of money. And then under that, with that, you have to try and stay under the luxury tax thresholds. It's a lot to try and balance. And, having a player like Tyler Hero taking up just about 21% of your salary cap is a pretty big obstacle to overcome, in my opinion. But, the Heat are going to be at least in contention again next year. But there's also, as much as everybody talks about, the West is without a doubt deeper, and overall I'd say is more talented than the East, but I think that people sort of throw that out there and overlook how many, very solid teams there are in the East, where when you talk about the hierarchy there, nobody ever really mentions the Indiana Pacers or the Orlando Magic or the Cleveland Cavaliers. It's probably going to be those same 8 teams you'd have to imagine next year that are going to be, in playoff positioning. And the Heat are just they're going to have to prove that they are better than these other teams, because I know it's been, really when you look at it calendar-wise, it's been just over a year since they were in the finals. But, ultimately, I think they have to reestablish themselves in a big way. But, again, let me know in the comments section how you feel on the state of the Miami Heat. But we're going to be taking our next break here, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to start to dive into a little bit more MLB content, starting with the biggest snubs from the All-Star game that, we got the full rosters over the weekend, so we're going to be diving into all of that. So we will be right back with that. Don't go anywhere. Stick with us.